It's a real pleasure to see everybody here on our seminar, our webinar, which is from the Trust Democracy Project. Trust in European Democracies, funded very generously by the European Union. And in particular today, our goal is to bring together some of the major players who have been working actively as organizations in the study of trust, particularly cross-nationally, and to bring together to talk about some of the findings, and particularly the methods, what's the best way in which we can measure both trust and trustworthiness. And it's going to be a pleasure. I'll introduce all of our speakers. The challenge, just to highlight from the beginning, I think, is that we have many, many long series of cross-national surveys looking at trust. And what we haven't had, I don't think, is as much work focusing on trustworthiness, a relationship which can be related to both the individual, how much you trust, for example, the media or politics or government, how much you trust science, how much you trust a range of other agencies, and then the performance or the activities of those institutions as well. Bringing those two things together through performance indicators, as well as survey opinion, as well as experimental data, I think would be very much part of the aim of True Dem. So let's start by introducing the speakers. And if we can go to the live shots of them now, let me introduce each one, and then we're going to kick off in the order of the program. Monica Brisi, very welcome, originally from Rome, she tells me, working for the OECD Directorate of Public Governance, head of the Governance Indicators and Performance Division of the OECD, Directorate for Public Governance. And the OECD, I think, has worked for many years in this field and has been always working in an interested in this in the background. But in particular, in 2021, the OECD launched its Trust Survey, a nationally representative survey on public trust and the drivers of this in 22 OECD countries. And why would the OECD work on this? Well, the basic aim is that public trust leads to greater compliance with a wide range of public policies. So if governments are facing challenges, whether it's COVID, whether it's climate change, whether it's migration, whether it's the economy and inflation, the OECD wants to think about how we can strengthen trust and trustworthiness so governments and citizens can work together through participation, social cohesion, and institutional legitimacy. So welcome, Monica. Thank you very much for joining us from Paris. We're all very envious of Paris as well in late spring. In addition, let me introduce also Carrie Funk, who's the Director, Science and Society Research at the Pew Research Center. And I'm sure many of us who are part of this webinar have worked with the Pew data. It's one of the most useful cross-national surveys, which is done, always very topical. And this is an area which the Pew has had deep research, particularly in the United States, when it's looked at trends over time in many different agencies, but also cross-nationally. And again, this is a topic which is something which, again, we've worked on. And I think the other main area of Pew strength is very much, I think, on the media, both the social media as well as the legacy media. And so Carrie, who's worked very much on trust in science, I hope can talk about some of these other broader areas that Pew has been working on. And again, it's one of the most foremost polling organizations, I think, in the United States, because it really brings together excellent social science insights, along with a good impact on topical issues, which gets out to policymakers. So very much welcome, Carrie. And then David, for the Edelman Trust. So head of research for the Edelman Trust Institute, Dr. Bursoff is the lead researcher of all of the different Edelman trust-oriented projects, including most particularly the Edelman Trust Barometer. And Edelman has been a pioneer in this field. 20 years now, I believe, has been looking at these issues with an annual survey, and in particular, thinking about trust for business, as well as trust for government, and trust for other type of civic society agencies as well. And in all those cases, trust, it's argued, is the ultimate currency in the relationship for all institutions, business, governments, NGO, and the media, how they can link to their stakeholders. So I think as well, we've got an excellent panel. And without further ado, I'd like us to kick off. And for everybody, the key questions are these. Number one, what are the key findings that you've observed in each of your different surveys that you've been looking at? Number two, what can we learn from this about the methods and the evidence that we need to collect in our own project? TrueGov has only just started. It's only been going for a fairly short period, and we really are therefore at the beginning of a 3-year process. And if we can steal some ideas from each of you, then I think that's going to be really helpful, and hopefully work together in future collaborations as well. And in addition to that, what we want to do is really think about the issue of trust and trustworthiness. So we're not only going to be thinking about public opinion survey, but all the methods that can be used. For example, survey experiments are something that we're going to try and bring into our projects, but there are games and game theorizing, which has been done by, for example, behavioral economics. There are issues of other sorts of techniques, focus groups, for example, which some of you may have engaged in as well, qualitative interviews with key policymakers, as well as with members of the public, and a variety of different different approaches that we might want to think about. So without further ado, I'd like to invite you to make your presentation, 15 minutes per speaker, and I'll indicate briefly if we're running over in any way. Monica, let's hear from the OCD.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. Let me share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. So I will start. I don't see you, so just let me know if there is any issue with the presentation or with my voice. So thanks a lot for
Monica,
this. Yes.
Monica, can you just turn it into slideshow? Because at present it's a static image. So go to slideshow, go to play from the beginning.
I do go to, yeah.
That's it, perfect.
Okay. I still don't see you, so I hope now this is not at least it's not a static image. So
it's still not quite doing it. Just try, if you try clicking from beginning once more. I think somehow it's not moving. I don't know why.
It's not moving because
not moving.
Apologies. Let me try to put it down and share again.
Technology, as we say, is not always our friend in all of these issues. And by the way, it's lovely to see everybody else on the screen as well, because lots of old friends have joined us, which is great.
I will shorten the presentation by the 2 minutes that I'm wasting, and apologies.
No, it's technology.
Can you see it as a slideshow?
Yes, perfect. Thanks, Monica, that works.
So I go back. So thanks a lot. So really happy to have this discussion on and present the results of the trust survey that we launched almost a year ago in July 2022. And just a way of introduction to say that the work is a work that has been done in close collaboration with the participating countries, and more generally with the 38 OECD countries, and it's a long time in the making before launching the survey, to which 22 OECD countries participated. And in most countries, the survey was carried out at the end of 2021, in November 2021. So obviously 2 years in the COVID-19 pandemic. And we need to consider that the results and the comparison across countries need to be considered, also the specific context of a country at the time. But also it's important to underline right away that the results vary considerably from country to country for a range of cultural, social, institutional factors that are very important when we measure trustworthiness of public institutions. So at the same time, what I will present today is some general results that hold for all OECD members and reveal common challenges for democracies. And in fact, the results of the survey have become a bit different of an OECD initiative that is called the Reinforcing Democracy Initiative, that looks at the major governance challenges that democracies are facing today. So the first, let's say, top line result is that we find an even split between those who trust the national government and those who don't. Around 4 out of 10 people say that they have high or moderately high trust in the government, and more or less the same share that they have no or low trust in the government. And this is also due to the type of scale that we use. We can discuss this a bit later on. You see already that there is a large variation across countries, and even when we look more granularly within countries, there is a wide variation across the institutions that we considered in the survey. So here is the result again on the OECD average, and again, not surprisingly, and very much in alignment with results from other international surveys, such as the one from Edelman and Pew Research. We found that law enforcement institutions and the courts are perceived as more trustworthy. On the low end, instead, we found political parties, parliaments, but also news media, which is the only non-public institution that we consider. So, but as I said, our work is not so much about about levels of trust, people trust in public institutions, but instead on trying to understand what drives this trust in government and in public institution. And so the way the survey is built is around this framework that has been developed in the past 10 years or so. And obviously the framework builds on a lot of academic research, most likely from many people present today. What we consider in this framework, and therefore in the survey, is essentially to look at trustworthiness of government and public institution as a function of competence and values, meaning how citizens perceive the responsiveness and the reliability of governments in designing and delivering policies and services, but also the values of governments, such as openness, integrity, and fairness. And then we have another set of drivers of trust that are more linked with political drivers, interest, ability to participation, social, economic status, culture, and economic situation. So both at individual and at the collective level. And finally, we also look at the perception of citizens about government's capacity to address intergenerational and global challenges. And we had very interesting results also on this last block of drivers, which was introduced only in the cross-country survey of 2021. So what are the main messages or main result? The first important message is that on average, government are seen as reliable, even during COVID, so that citizens are reasonably confident that governments can deliver public services. Here we see satisfaction with healthcare, education, and administrative services, which were obviously largely impacted by the COVID crisis. We also see with further analysis that actually the satisfaction with public services is also a key driver of trust in national government, and I will show this later on. In the same vein with reliability of government, we find that people, around half of the respondents say that the government would be prepared for a future pandemics, for a future crisis. Only 1/3 of the respondents say that they think that the government would not be prepared. Here again, you see a large variation across countries, but you see in this graph also that positive perception of preparedness for a future pandemic are also associated with higher trust in the national government. And I will get back to this. We have a number of other measures of reliability of national government, and all these measures point to the same, let's say, positive results, confirm that there is a confidence, for example, in the government using personal data for legitimate purposes. There is confidence in the access to information about governmental processes, and so on and so far. So what are instead the drivers that explain that trust is under strain? What we see is that that comes clearly across all the OECD countries. And so in this case, the variation among countries is much smaller, is that there is a discrepancy between people's expectations and their perception of government responsiveness, participation, and representation. And I will show with some example what these three aspects mean. There is also a poor perception of public integrity. I won't show it today just for lack of time, but you can find it in the report. So here, for example, you see how governments are seen by many as are responsive to public feedback. So only a minority say that the public service would be improved if people complained. And again, as I said, with the exception of Korea, where we have more than 50% of respondents who instead said that they think that the government would improve public services on the basis of people's feedback, all the other countries, the differences are not so large. And similar results we have for other measures of responsiveness, for example, adapting a national policy to public demands, or implementing or the civil service, the civil service implementing an innovative idea, and so on and so far. When we look at measure of participation, again, and in this case, overtly political process, here we found that 1 in 3 people think that the current political system let them have a say in decision making, and almost half instead think that they don't have a voice in the current political system. And indeed, poor results on participation, on public participation, are really important on enhancing trust in national government, but also in the other public institutions, also the non-political ones. In fact, we see that trust is strongly associated with perception that the government acts on people's feedback. Here, for example, you see on the first, on the OECD average, you see that the share of people trusting their national government is 3 times higher among those who are confident that the government would adopt opinions expressed in public consultation than among the skeptics. So again, there is this strong sense of not meaningful engagement with government, with public institutions. Finally, there is also a representation gap, which is very important when we look at when we disaggregate the data on trust by population groups. Not surprisingly, disadvantaged groups tend to have lower trust. But what we see in this graph is that the gap, the difference in trust is not so high for what regards socioeconomic conditions, such as, or demographic conditions, such as income, education, and age, that you see on the right of the graph, even though obviously there is, and it's a worrisome result, there is always, for people with low income, low education, younger people have less trust in the government. However, what we find here is that the largest gap is among groups of those who have lower political voice, who feel more excluded by the political system, who feel that they don't have an ability of participating, and who have perception of their own financial and social vulnerability. So these are just main results, but then as I said, the point for this work was really to understand, to provide some evidence on what drives trust and how governments can become more trustworthy. And so here, in a sense, it's a bit of a summary of the questions of what governments should do, where they should invest in order to enhance their trustworthiness. And here again, you have the results on average across all the participating countries, and you see on the y-axis, you see that increase the confidence of people that the government is prepared for a future crisis would yield almost a 7 percentage point increase in trust in the government if we left all the other conditions at the same. So this is really like a measure of the impact of each factors on trust in government. Again, you see that increasing the perception of people having a political voice would yield 5 percentage point increase in trust in the national government, with all the other conditions left the same. You see also in this graph on the x-axis the efforts, let's say, that the government would need and that the society would need to put forward in order to enhance trust. You see that people are less satisfied on a number of variables, such as political voice, accountability for public consultation views, etc., and more satisfied, so in a sense would be easier to enhance trust in those areas, such as improving satisfaction with administrative services or preparedness for future crises. So these are just the main results, but these results were very important also to design the next round of the survey. So in a sense, the main takeaways are gain on enhancing reliability, so continue improving preparedness for future crises, designing better public services. The second aspect is this aspect of meaningful engagement with citizens, not only in the delivery of services, but in the policy design, the reform, enhance political voice, ensure the inclusion of vulnerable groups, and as I said, also invest in public integrity. Out of this work, so countries have committed to participate and to replicate the survey every 2 years. So we are now almost ready to go out in the field in September 2023 for the second round. In this case, there will be more countries participating. There are 30 OECD countries. It remains a survey where countries need to opt in to participate. And we will obviously continue to have the same questionnaire, the same type of questions, but given the results that I just showed, we will also add questions on 3 areas that we think is important now to improve the understanding. The first is about horizontal accountability in the government, in the democratic system, but also people's ability to verify government performance. This obviously also reflect works done in premise by Pippa Norris and others regarding the capacity of people to verify what the government does and whether this has an impact on trust in institutions. The second aspect is to look at mechanism of direct democracy to address the participation and representation deficit. And finally, we will also have a sort of a focus on what different population groups, including young people, value most to deem a government trustworthy, because the results show also that there might be a question of changes of values across generations, and that we need to take that into account in the design of policies and the resilience of democracies. So just a few smaller points to respond to the question on the methodological aspect. Maybe the first point that I like to underline is the to be parsimonious with the survey instrument. We have a large survey questionnaire. So we try to, there are many interesting things to analyze. Obviously, there is interest to analyze more and more things, but instead, for us, it's important also to keep the focus on this aspect of drivers of trust and links between public governance and trustworthiness of institutions. At the same time, acknowledging that across countries, there are institutional cultural differences that are more difficult to measure. And so at the same time, keep focus on this, but instead use the results from other international exercise to complement the information. We have already used results from Edelman, from Pew Research, obviously on these areas that we don't cover. We have tested at this point the methodological choices and the data collection have been tested extensively, also with the help of some national statistical offices. And so we will produce also sort of update of what the OECD did in 2017, which were these guidelines to measuring trust, where measure of trust in public institutions was still a kind of an experimental measurement. And now the idea is to update these guidelines on this aspect. And so for us would be obviously very useful to complement the survey with other methods, so experiment, games, focus group, in order to, so these are methods that we won't be able to do, but only in specific countries or only with the help of National Statistical Office. So obviously would be very interesting for us to have more knowledge on these other instruments beyond a population survey. And then finally, on the question of how we connect the data about citizen perception, expectations, and then performance of governments to strengthen trust, we do that on what we call gateway to reinforcing trust, where it really is about different methods. So there is the survey, but there are also focus group, interviews to policy leaders in countries, and understand also a number of objective public governance indicators in countries to understand how countries can, what are the main challenges specific to the country and what they can do. So we have already carried out a number of these country focus studies, and we will continue to do so. So this is in 50 minutes, I hope, the main result, and happy to discuss those. Thank you.
You're on mute, Pippa.
There we go. Thank you so much, Monica, for a very clear presentation and overview of the OECD's work. Can I just ask the one question which an economist would ask to stand in as devil's advocate? He would say, well, of course, public opinion is related. So people participate if they have satisfaction, if they have trust, etc. It's the objective indicators of what government does. What's the relationship between that and trust? And I know that you alluded to that at the end. You have a number of different performance indicators at OECD. What about a more comprehensive comparison between outcomes and outputs against public trust? How far have you come in that area of work?
We have come far for what regards a country-specific study, because I think so in that you will find really a sort of a mapping of. So these are the results, and we start the country studies from the results of the survey and go back to what the government is doing and what are the the objective indicators, the output of governments, and link those. We have started doing that also cross country, and so you give me the occasion to say that next Friday on 30th of June we will launch the publication Government at a Glance, which is a statistical publication where you see exactly that. It's a publication where we have a number of indicators on input, processes, and output of governments in many areas such as budgeting, integrity, participation, openness, etc. And we link those also with the results on trust.
That's great. And so I'm really looking forward to seeing the correlations that are there, because that's more objective evidence of does performance actually relate to public trust, or is it an irrational feeling? People in Sweden or in Norway always trust their government, people in Italy and Greece don't. So I think that'll be an interesting development. I'm sure we can come back to that. Carrie, let's come back to you. And the Pew organization has obviously done a tremendous work, Pew Research Center. Let's talk about what you've found as well. Carrie.
Wonderful. You can see everything and you can hear me, so I'm just pausing for that. And I would say on, the useful part from a measurement perspective of the coronavirus outbreak is that we saw a lot more of that. There's a lot of opportunities to think about government performance and how that connects with people's judgments. Certainly some really impressive correlations between the number of deaths, unfortunately, and people's evaluation of government performance. I haven't seen so many people put that to trust as the dependent variable, but I've seen people look at trust as the independent variable around these things. Right. And that's really part of the whole thing, right? Governments often need people to pay attention to the information that they provide and usually to do something. And public health is an arena where you see that quite clearly, where it's very clear. As you need people to trust that information so that you'll do something, so that you'll get out of the way if there's a hurricane, so that you'll take a vaccine if that's going to prevent the spread of infection and so on. I'm going to lean in especially to kind of takeaways from our research that might influence how you think about measuring public trust. And I'm going to make you kind of broaden out in terms of thinking about different aspects, different ways we've measured trust. I'm hoping, here's the thing. I felt like something wasn't working quite right, and it's not working quite right. Are you seeing a slide progress? Because I'm not. There we go.
No.
There we go. There's a slide progressing. So I just wanted to be clear, my own work, we have more than 100 researchers at Pew Research Center, and we're organized around kind of broad topic areas. We have a group that specializes in global surveys, and that's who you might be thinking of when you think about some of our work. My own specialty is primarily in US surveys, but I'm one of the lucky ones who's been able to do work in both the US and cross-nationally. And you'll probably notice that most of our work is very bespoke. It's often very in-depth. We're focused primarily on public opinion surveys, but we also do quite a bit of demographic research and more and more data science or computational social science methods, particularly around behaviors in social media. I'm going to focus on what we're doing in science, but you'll see that it's broad. This is for the past 8 years, I've focused on public views of science and scientists, and there's quite a strong interest in the scientific community around public trust in science. So I've really been doing quite a bit of work thinking about trust. There's, I think, quite a bit of room for cross-pollination between kind of politics and science. I have always found looking at trust from these different lenses kind of helps me spark new ideas. And so I think that I hope at least that you'll find some ways in which to see different angles to bring to your work on trust in government or trust in democracy. This is, I think, what has become a key measure in the US for our kind of broadest take on public trust in groups and institutions. Each row is a separate question. You're asking how much confidence do you have, for the first row, in medical scientists to act in the best interests of the public. You get 4 choices: a great deal, a fair amount, not too much, or no confidence at all. And I think we can learn a lot about trust in this kind of comparative context, particularly, is 30% on the top row a lot or a little, or is it something in between? So you really need that, that set of institutions and groups to offer that comparison. Government here is represented in the bottom row by elected officials, and that's just kind of a reminder of how low trust in government has fallen in the US over time. And this is the same data where we're showing the trend, the value of the trend over time, using the exact same questions over time, and you can see all response categories there. Just as a side note, so you know that we also use a split form design so that people are answering either their confidence in medical scientists or their confidence in scientists. But you see in the top row, the groups that tend to be more trusted are scientists and the military. The kind of middle groups are police officers, public school leaders, religious leaders, and then the groups at the bottom with much lower levels of trust. And in fact, majorities really expressing a negative view of them are journalists, business leaders, and elected officials. Now, and this is just a close-up of our trust in scientists over time. And I just wanted to use this as an example of the potential value of having these trend measures. Goes well beyond the top line, right? That's when you can start to do the analysis of who's moving up and down. And of course, for us, the start of a global pandemic raised questions about what would happen to trust in scientists. We had this lovely trend, which is showing us that among Republicans in the US, we see really a drop in overall confidence in scientists to act in the best interests of the public. You see now a growth up to 36% of Republicans now have a negative view, saying they have not too much or no confidence at all in scientists. A much smaller share have the strongest level of trust, saying they have a great deal of confidence, but still a majority have what I often call this kind of soft positive view. Among Democrats, you really don't see very much movement. So the story in the US of trust in scientists has been this widening political divide. This is just to remind you that whatever widening political divide is happening over scientists is nothing in comparison to political divisions over other groups and institutions. Here, particularly journalists, you see a majority of Republicans having a negative view of whether or not journalists would act in the best interests of the public. Democrats are more positive by comparison, obviously not glowing, but that's really something to keep in mind, is kind of the size of these gaps and to pay attention to that. When we were looking for measures that we could use in a cross-national survey, we often need to simplify the wording a bit. So we did that here as well. We adapted those confidence measures for a global survey of 20 publics that was conducted just prior to the start of the pandemic. These data are the medians across the 20. And the question is, how much do you trust for the first row, the military to do what is right for the survey public? So for France, for Germany, for Spain, and you get 4 options: a lot, some, not too much, or not at all. And here we use national government instead of elected officials. We have fewer groups overall, but still you get some comparative leverage on these data. So, and then this is just kind of an example, again, of the kinds of things you can do with these ratings. So trust in the military and trust in scientists tended to stand out as higher than trust in these other groups. And here we sorted the places we surveyed into countries where trust in the military was higher, relatively speaking, areas where trust in scientists was higher, relatively speaking, and then the group in the middle are where they're comparable, essentially, between the two. This is another example of what we can do and what we can learn from these kinds of measures. We often saw a correlation between a person's ideological leaning, left, right, or center, and their trust in scientists and the military. But as it turns out, for scientists, those on the left tend to be more trusting. And for the military, those on the right tended to be more trusting. So to my mind, actually, these kinds of analyses have been really helpful as we've looked over time to understand these broad patterns going on across countries. It's pretty rare that these kinds of correlations are equally strong in every place, or that they're even present in every single place that you survey if you're doing 20 or 40 or more countries. But I think you get a picture of the patterns that you can't find without this kind of data. The gist of my point in all of these slides to date is to really just suggest how much you can glean from these kinds of systematic measures, even if they're imperfect. So we can quibble over the exact wording. You may or may not like it, but there's a lot that you can take away from it. And that's part of what you get from comparing these different cross-national survey sets, is that they're not exactly the same. They ask things in a little bit different way, but you often do see some common patterns across these data, and that's extremely useful. Now I'm going to take you to some other examples that we've done in the US, just to show you some different ways to approach these measures. We often see wide agreement around the concept that trust is multifaceted. And a few years back, we were trying to act on that, to do better at kind of pulling apart the dimensions of trust. And so we were trying to look at the idea of people's trust in scientists as having different dimensions around competence or warmth. And so each row is trying to capture that, competence to do a good job, warmth or empathy to care about people's best interests. In this case, people are rating medical researchers. And then the third is kind of a trust in information, to provide fair and accurate information. The other thing we were trying to do here was really act on a common definition of trust as really being an expectation for behavior and for the future. So people are rating your expectation that an actor, medical researchers, would do something all or most of the time, some of the time, only a little or none of the time. And then we did something similar on the bottom rows. So the bottom rows are really pushing on the potential sources of distrust in medical researchers. We have transparency, we have accountability, and we have they're all kind of issues of integrity, let me put it that way. The key finding from the data, is really the contrast between these positives and negatives, if you will. Depending on how you see it, people are reasonably trusting of medical researchers, let's say, to do a good job. But we really were struck by how much kind of skepticism there is around these issues of integrity. So 12% of Americans said that medical researchers admit their own mistakes and take responsibility for them when they occur, all or most of the time. So I would lean you towards really thinking about how do we measure the sources of mistrust and distrust in society, in addition, of course, to a metric that just tapping how much trust is there. But if you want to understand kind of what's going on and where it's coming from and how perhaps to address it, it seems to me we don't pay enough attention to these kinds of sources. And it's interesting, Monica was bringing up some of the same ideas. Transparency accountability, right? This is really important.
Right.
I think relatedly is the idea of negative experiences. So that might come up some in our discussion as well, that we didn't really talk about with Monica, is like when things go wrong, what has happened and how that can drive mistrust for a very long time. All right, I have one other example for you, which is related to trust and information. I thought it might be useful as well. Here we were looking at how much people trust different information from different kinds of sources. We did this in a number of different ways, but this is just an example. When they're getting information about science, they're rating different groups of people in each row. How much can they rely on, for the first row, experts in science for information about it? So a lot, some, I think not too much, not at all. And certainly the data are good for experts. Experts look like they're trusted as a source of information. But we were also very struck by how much kind of at least soft trust there is in information from close family and friends. In some ways, that seems like a puzzle. They don't have particular expertise around science, but they're largely trusted for information about science. And I think the answer really has to do with the sense of motivation, that close family and friends are trusted as kind of not trying to steer you wrong, not having an agenda, having your best interests at heart. And really that what drives that home really comes from qualitative work. So I'm going to show you some examples of that, where you hear people talking about it, that their trust in close family and friends is because they have unbiased motives. They're wanting the best for you. They don't have an agenda or an ulterior motive. So here's just a couple of quotes we collected recently. These are qualitative in-person interviews around people who have a level of vaccine hesitancy. The first person raises the idea, of course, of profit motives for vaccine manufacturers. And what that does for him is tell him he needs to do more to look beyond the message, right? The second person is really talking about the issue of contradicting information. Sources always say one thing, they say another thing, they don't know who to believe. And what he did was pull back completely and say, I'm just going to rely on my inner circle as the only sources of trustworthy information. And then the third person is making that point of that information she sees as trustworthy is information where she thinks the source is not coming at it with an agenda. So that those, I think, are helpful things to push on. We've asked about motivations and a sense of motivations in a different way, but none of them are perfect. These are just a few reminders of the kind of measurement choices you have ahead. I think there are differences in the findings for each, but there are certainly value no matter how you go around it. I would be paying particular attention to potential sources of distrust or mistrust. I don't think we do that enough. Certainly, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, I've been in so many conversations about trust and the need for more trust, and certainly the need for institutional leaders to think about ways that they show their trustworthiness. You use the word trustworthiness a little differently. When we're talking to leaders, we're reminding them that they need to prove themselves trustworthy in order to earn public trust. And certainly we've just touched a little bit about why trust matters. There are consequences, I think we've seen quite clearly for citizens' behavior. Sometimes there are assumptions that leaders make about what would happen if they had high levels of public trust. And there's sometimes a kind of an interest in more of a carte blanche from the public. I would think that's a false assumption. But so you want to kind of unpack some of those things so that we're not going too blindly and saying that all trust is good, that people have trust that's contingent on performance at some level. So with that, let me turn it over to others. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Carrie, so much for the Pew overview. And again, let me just, before we move on, just think about the trust in science and say, well, look, there could be 4 or 5 different explanations about what's going on. One could be shock events. And so when you have time series, when something happens, whether it's the effective vaccine or whether it's misinformation from government, that could affect. It could be leadership cues, rhetoric. and partisan changes might have a difference. It could be media coverage, positive or negative. We've got some information about that on science. Or it could be education, how much people have a knowledge about science from their schooling and things like that. And so understanding, I wonder if you at Pew had thought about how one might start to monitor the dynamics when it goes up and down in America or in other countries. You know, how does one sort out those sorts of ways of thinking about why it might change?
Can I address education and knowledge? Because it's a constant hypothesis that it's if only people knew more, they would have more trust. And I think it's certainly a concept that comes up a lot for government as well. If people understood what to do and what they do, they would have more trust. We tend to see in the data that interaction effect between party and education, or sometimes we have a more direct measure of knowledge about science. And you see the same idea that the people with the idea that, you know, depending on the direction, it can go in either direction, but let's say something that is that the more educated partisans are paying more attention to those cues, right, from political leaders. So they tend to line up more closely with the kind of dominant message of that party. So as a result, let me see if I can get one example for you. As a result, you know, Democrats are more concerned about climate change, especially if they're highly educated compared to low educated, but there's like no effect among Republicans of education, that kind of thing.
I was thinking though also about just science education per se. Have they taken classes in biology, chemistry, and those sorts of things?
Yeah,
and I know that
yes, absolutely. I mean, absolutely, but I mean, they're all correlated. They're all and they're imperfect, right? So we have education as a proxy. We've used direct measures of science education. We've used direct measures of knowledge or information about science, which is nice because it doesn't require a certain level of formal education.
That's right.
But you're going to get the same patterns across.
And I know that John Miller, who's also with us, has also worked on some of these issues. And so it's a big topic. So thank you very much, Carrie. We'll come back to some of these questions again. Let's move to our final speaker and the Edelman Trust and David Bursoff, and all of the work which you've been doing now for 20 years annually on trust and trustworthiness. Yeah. Please, David.
Yes, thank you very much. As Pippa just pointed out, our trust measure has been in continuous use since 2001. And while it wasn't spawned in a traditional rigorous validation study, what we do have is 23 years of data that demonstrates its stability, its ability to differentiate among countries, institutions, and demographic groups, and its power as a predictor or driver. And so what I want to do is sort of give you some highlights of the last 23 years of trust data from Edelman. Let's start with our trust measure. First, we have a general trust question. This is the one that's been around since 2001. I think, as the others, ours is very simple. Below is a list of institutions. For each one, please indicate how much you trust that institution to do what is right. And you mark that on a 9-point scale, where 1 means you don't trust them at all, and 9 means you trust them a great deal. So we have the granularity when we need it. It's a simple measure. It's a measure that is versatile enough that you can compare trust or use it to measure trust in individual companies, institutions, people, almost anything. In addition, we augment our general trust research with trust research into specific issues, say climate or health or technology. And what we do in those cases is we use a situational form of the trust question, which reads almost exactly the same, except in this case, this is an example from health, trust in health, to do what is right when it comes to addressing your health-related needs and concerns. But generally, the scale is the same. The institutions are asked in the same way, which then allows us to look at general trust in institutions vis-a-vis trust in institutions when it comes to specific issues or specific areas of action. So when we talk about trust or look at trust as a simple measure that we apply to various institutions, This is, for example, our most recent findings across 27 countries, where we see that business is the only institution in blue that's fully trusted, followed by NGOs, followed by government and media, which are further behind. A couple of nuances. As we characterize trust, an institution is trusted if 60% or more of people said that they trusted it. So if 60% on average of people in a country or globally gave an institution a top 4 rating, then that institution was considered trusted. If somewhere between 50 and 59% said that they trusted an institution, we give that sort of a neutral or transitional trust rating. And then institutions, people, whatever, where less than half of people gave a top 4 box trust rating on our 9-point scale, those were considered to be distrusted institutions. So this is sort of the lay of the land, little interesting historic tidbit. NGOs for years were the most trusted societal institutions of the 4. About the last 3 or 4 years, business took over the lead, and as you can see here, still hangs on to that lead. And measuring trust in this way, sort of looking at it at the institutional level and comparing them, has really opened up a very interesting dynamic for us. And one of the key dynamics is not just trust in government and trust in business, but the relative levels of trust in business versus government. And what you can see here is not only, as we saw before, business is more trusted than government, but that the gap between trust in government and business overall is 12 points. And in certain countries, it's much higher than that. There are other countries where it's reversed, but the general trend is much higher trust in government and business versus government. And we feel that that dynamic, that trust disparity, particularly when government is seen as being distrusted, opens up a leadership void, and that people are looking to business to fill that leadership void. And this tension, this dynamic, this trust dichotomy is a lot of what's driving a lot of calls for businesses to be more engaged in social issues, to become more invested in helping solve societal problems, because they're more trusted than government. And so even though government may, theoretically be the one who's ultimately responsible or needs to take the lead, given the situation now, people are looking more towards business because it's more trusted. We also use the measure not only to measure trust in institutions, but also trust in institutional leaders and people. The exact same question, except instead of government, we'll say government leaders. Instead of media, we'll say journalists. And so what you can see here is that traditional institutional or societal leaders, government leaders, journalists, CEOs, tend to be distrusted and less trusted than my fellow citizens, my neighbors, my coworkers, and the CEO of my company versus CEOs in general. So that's an interesting finding. The other kind of interesting nuance here is that when we look, we tend to find that the institutional leaders tend to be less trusted than the institutions themselves. So government, certainly not a poster child for trust, but came in at the low 50s. Government leaders came in at 41. So what we're seeing is that there's less trust, less respect for the people who occupy leadership positions than there is for the institutions that they lead. So in addition to measuring trust in individual institutions, the 4 we just talked about, what we also do is we compute an index, which is essentially the average trust across the 4 institutions. And so what you can see here is what that data looks like between 2022 and 2023. And a couple of things to notice. First of all, trust is fairly stable year over year, which is what you'd want in a trust measure. So it did change, but only by 2 points year over year. There were some countries that were winners. The US and Kenya, for example, had a decently good trust year. South Korea, Australia, much less so. You can also see that autocracies tend to do a lot better than democracies in terms of overall trust in societal institutions. And this is where we really sometimes get that issue of the difference between trust and trustworthiness. So you see results like this where China, UAE, Saudi Arabia, they're up near the top. And the question is that trust advantage? Is there higher trust levels? Is that a reflection of a true reality that their citizens really do have more faith and trust and confidence in their government? Is it an artifact of the fact that autocracies tend to not have dissenting voices, which help sort of mediate trust ratings? Is it fear of reprisal? Is it limited access to news and information? We think it's some combination thereof, but it certainly is a finding that we have witnessed over many years, where single party systems tend to have more trusting citizenry than democracies, particularly Western democracies. And as you can see here, there's no Western democracy other than perhaps Mexico, but in terms of traditional Western democracies that are really in that trusted zone. Another thing that we've really uncovered by looking at the index versus looking at individual trust in institutions is over time, the difference between higher income and lower income. And the way that's changed. Back in 2012, both the top quartile and the bottom quartile were basically living in a reality where they couldn't trust their social institutions. And what's happened over the last 10 years is that if you're in that lower income level, your trust really hasn't budged. You can almost look at this line as, a trust level of 45 plus or minus 2, really flat, no movement, no change in the reality for the poor. Among the more affluent, we're seeing that they went from distrusting to neutral to fully trusting. And so now we're to a point where there's two very distinct trust realities depending on your income. And in many ways, I think having two different trust realities within a society is more problematic and more destabilizing than everybody thinking that social institutions are not trustworthy. Because if everybody agrees that something's wrong, we're all pulling in the same direction for change, we're all seeing a common reality, we're in the same boat. But if you're in a situation where one group is basically okay with the status quo and another group has chronically been underdressed and are feeling frustrated, you have one group that's looking for tweaking the status quo and another group that wants to blow the whole thing up. And I think we see that in a lot of the populism uprisings and the rising of demagogues in various countries around the world. In addition to sort of measuring individual trust, developing an index, we also dimensionalize trust. And we dimensionalize trust in a couple of different ways, but at the end, it sort of ladders up, and we've seen this in the earlier presentations, into some sort of ability, capability component. So does the institution do what it needs to do? Does it fulfill its basic premise? And it's easier to see in, say, something like business. So in other words, does the company deliver what it says on the tin? Does the airline get you safely from point A to point B? Do my packages show up on time? And then an ethics dimension, which is less about can they get the job done and more about their integrity, their motivations, how fair they are. And so we tend to dimensionalize trust across those two dimensions. And when we do, we get some interesting results. So for example, this is our 4 institutions, business, NGOs, media, and government, plotted on a 2x2 looking at ethics by competence. And sort of in keeping with the basic trust findings, you see that government and media are both largely seen as less competent and unethical. Business is the only institution that's seen as both ethical and competent. NGOs, good ethics score, but not a high competence score. So this allows us to kind of unpack a little bit the difference, the trust difference between NGOs and business. And we use this in again, our discussion of why business is being called upon to fill gaps in leadership left by government. Because if you think about a government that's not successfully addressing our problems, it would be easy to think, or sort of an obvious next institution would be the NGO, because NGOs sort of as part of their remit is about filling gaps in the social safety net, addressing problems, filling holes left by government. And yet we're in a situation where business is much more likely to be called on to help address and engage in social problems. And I think the reason that's true is right here, that in a world where we have paralysis, where things are not getting done, where government is ineffectual, people are drawn to an institution that's competent, that gets things done. Business may not be a hero, but they're at least an anti-hero. They may have certain questionable ethical histories or ethical behaviors, but they're ethical enough. And as you can see, their ethics score has been rising over the past 3 years, but more importantly, they get things done. And in the world today, what people are dying for is progress, for some sense of movement, and business is more likely to deliver that. In addition to measuring trust in its various forms and dimensionalizing it, we also look at what are the drivers of trust. So independently of the dimensions, what drives trust? And here's an example of a driver analysis we did looking at what increases the likelihood that someone is going to trust government to address climate change. And we can see that the number one driver of trusting government with climate is actually when government balances climate action with the country's energy needs. And this data is from 2022. This was in the middle of the, well, I guess we're still in the middle of the Ukraine war, but this was the point where winter was coming. Europe was looking like it was going to freeze because of a lack of energy resources. And you saw that one of the drivers of trusting government was a government that didn't essentially go too far on the green side when I, as an individual, was worried about keeping my family warm. Other things that drove trust was, is it effective at getting business to reduce emissions? Is it coordinating with local entities? And is it subsidizing new technology? So we look at trust, and we also try to understand what drives trust both in general and in the context of specific issues. We also use trust as a driver. So one of the things we wanted to understand is polarization, which is a huge topic these days, crippling societies, government unable to get things done, paralysis everywhere. And we wanted to know what were the drivers of polarization, drivers of this sense that we have huge differences that we can't overcome. The number one driver was distrust in government. Second was a lack of shared identity. Distrust in media was also a player in polarization and in bringing back polarization. So here you can see that we use trust not only to sort of as a report card, but also as a way of understanding what else is going on in society, documenting the role of trust in other problems, other concerns and challenges. We did something similar when it came to vaccine and understanding people who got vaccinated versus those who didn't, and then people who got regular checkups versus those who didn't. And as you can see, when it comes to vaccination, two of the most important drivers or predictors of whether or not you get vaccinated was having a higher level of trust in the health ecosystem. So the components of the health system in your country, and then separate trust in government, which is not surprising because most vaccine programs were government entities or government run. And so trust in government was an important player there. Contrast that with getting a regular checkup, which is less of a government thing in many countries and more about how you interact with the healthcare system. And so here, trust in the healthcare system continues to be an important predictor of kind of preventative health, but trust in government dropped out. And then we further sort of drill down into that, looking at trust as a mitigator of the effect of social disparities on vaccine rates. So vaccine rates, traditionally well-known finding associated with income, also not surprisingly associated with the quality of healthcare that you had available to you. But what you find is that if you take those disadvantaged groups, the lower income groups, the people who have access to less quality healthcare, but you can get them to trust the system as a whole, those gaps close. And you start seeing the explanatory power of trust, which is sort of one of our ways of validating trust as a measure and showing its importance beyond just whether or not an organization is doing well. And then finally, in terms of where we're going next, the frontier of validation is looking at trust, the importance of trust in the context of variables that exist outside of surveys. So here what we did is we measured trust in a handful of companies and then saw how those company stocks performed over 2022 versus their sector average. And what you can see is that trusted companies had better stock performance than their sector average did. But this is sort of where we're going next. We're trying to find ways of measuring the impact that trust has or the value of trust beyond self-report, like I'd be more loyal to the brand or more loyal to my company or more likely to vote or what have you. This is where we're really looking next to solidify the foundation upon which trust is built and be able to make the argument that it is indeed an important predictor and driver.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much. And that last slide in particular got me excited because it can go in both directions. If you trust that company, you might be a more loyal customer, and so you might perform better. If, on the other hand, you perform better, you might also create more trust. And so the time lags on those sorts of things and the indicators we pick could be really important, right, David? If we get good indicators, not just of government, but of performance of the media, performance of NGOs, and think through these time lags with the continuous series, we can get some exciting new ways to think through what the direction of the relationship is. It's obviously interactive, right? But we could start to unpack some of the dynamics.
Absolutely. And that's more of what we want to do. We need to prove the case that trust is worth worrying about because it's related to real world KPIs that are keeping you up at night, you being whatever leader, whatever organization.
But also from the point of view of the actual nature of trust, we also want to know if you improve your performance, can you improve trust as an intrinsic value in society? And so understanding that dynamics, I think for all of us to go beyond the research on surveys to actually link it to the real world would be really great.
Exactly.
Well, look, let's open it up. I think that's an excellent presentation of Edelman and Pew and where we've gone. And Christian has just going to ask a question. I know, Christian Wazell. We also have a couple of questions in the chat room. So Chris, why don't you kick off? And I know you've been working on this a lot. And then what I'll do is I'll take three questions from the group, and then we'll go on to and come back to our speakers. Chris first.
Excellent. Thank you for the presentations. Very, very interesting, insightful, and I think also in the way they were composed is very complementary in terms of what you presented as results. Two issues came up for me here. The one is hitting directly into what Pippa said, deserved trust, undeserved trust. I had a presentation at our True Dem kickoff meeting where I tried to solve this puzzle measurement-wise. So what I did, and I wonder what the presenters think about that idea. I ran regression analyses where a person's average trust over a couple of institutions. So I took government, parliament, and the parties. You could take another selection and map that on actual performance. And we were working and still are working with different indicators from the World Bank, the control of corruption indicator, or from VDEM, the rule of law indicator, or there is right now an elite quality index available for 70 countries in the world, which is supposed to measure, it's not about democracy or anything like this, it's about institutional quality, on how much elites are committed to the public good, rather than putting all the money in their own pockets and seeing it as a source of enrichment. So these kinds of things. And then you run a regression, and then you get residuals, and we save them. And positive residuals mean that people have much more trust than the institutional performance that is actually in place deserves. And small negative residuals mean exactly the opposite. And what you get is for the countries that we have, for instance, in the World Value Survey, when they are autocratic, you have positive residuals all the time. So those are the countries where this is undeserved trust in a way. So this might resolve in some sense the autocratic high trust puzzle that David was very explicitly referring to. What we still don't know, and that is a methodological question, how much are those expressions of trust in authoritarian regimes, how authentic are they? Or are they just giving lip service to what people think the regime they are interviewed, and they don't know whether the interviewers are coming from a government agency, how much they have to please the expectations of the interviewer. So this all goes into social desirability. I have, however, my hunch is after several conversations with also China experts, that these trust numbers are as high as they are credible in a sense. Which relates me to a second point. I think there is a relatively complicated freeway interaction thing, and that has to do with authoritarian values. There's two papers recently published. One I did with Roberto Foa in Frontiers of Political Science, where we looked at coronavirus level changes in the UK in terms of trust in government, and you get like the rally around the flag effect. And another one is I did in the Journal of Trust Research, just published with Jan Delhay from Magdeburg University, which is also going after these issues. The thing is, we think we have indications that people who are more authoritarian in their values are not exactly fact checkers. Psychologically speaking, there's a scale of cognitive need. Those people are notoriously low on cognitive need. And that means they react to communication strategies in a very different way. Meaning, fact-free communication appeals to those people. And then it depends a little bit on who is in power. Because we saw also in our preliminary analysis, I'm going over this with Leonard when we are on the train ride to Sweden, the next day to have a work package 4 meeting with B. Puranen in Sangasabi. We have interesting evidence that, speaking about polarization, we don't see much evidence that voters of right-wing populist parties differ on ideological issues so dramatically as we might think from mainstream voters. Let's say on the sexuality issue, pro-life versus pro-choice, or on the migration issue, nativism versus cosmopolitan. Of course they differ, but not as dramatic as you may think. They differ on the confidence in institution.
So, Christian, just the question for the speakers, that's all.
Okay, just a couple of comments. So this was one thing, and I wonder what you think about that, and if you have some evidence on this. For instance,
let me bring in, if I can, we have some others in the line.
In Poland, the populists are in power.
Sure.
And the voters of the Law and Justice Party have much higher confidence in the institutions.
Of course.
In Germany, the AfD is not in power, and the voters of this party have much less confidence in the institutions.
Thanks, Christian. Thanks very much for the contribution. I hope we can come back and put the link to your paper in the chat room, and that way people can get to these sources. That would be really helpful. And I know that we've got a couple of other people who've been commenting, and I'd like to bring those in. And I'd also like to give Christian and Gesine an opportunity as well to talk. We've got questions about from Ira on Taurus on Turkey. Did you want to just mention to the group a little bit about the items you've mentioned on Turkey and the earthquake? It's another example of a shock event, a real shock event, of course, and how that might affect trust. Please, Emrah.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity, people. I thank you very much for these speakers as well. I'm kind of delighted to hear that such kind of valuable scholars are actually working on trust. I think it's a kind of a coincidence that we have started this project nearly the same in Turkey. And we started, it's funded by the Turkish National Research Foundation. We have completed our survey, and it's in our first year, and then we'll continue for the next 2 years as well. And then we'll collect, we also did some survey, beyond that survey research, we did some focus group research as well. We use the Q method as well for understanding or applying some kind of different methods to understand what's going on related to trust. About the earthquake, we ask a question on the survey, asking to the respondents if they have contributed to the NGO activities for earthquake relief and the type of those. And then we have seen that, and also we hypothesized that, of course, low levels of trust to government will be kind of, highly correlated with such kind of activities. The findings actually confirmed this hypothesis, but at the same time, we have found that there are some kind of interaction effect with the source of media use.
Yes.
The questions we asked in the survey also, actually the whole project tries to understand trust in three different spheres, I would say. The science, trust in science, trust in politics, and trust in media. So we have the questions about those, and then we had the chance to kind of control those variables. And we have seen that the use of non-conventional media sources and age is actually highly correlated, or this trust or low trust, I would say, in government is highly correlated or interacted with those issues. So one of my research assistants will present something sooner about this, but it's very exciting to see that this moderating effect, basically, because as Kerry had said, the usual work on trust utilizes trust as a dependent variable, but we are much interested in the consequences of it. So how does it actually, of course, the usual suspects are voting and stuff, and then we argue in the project that as high levels and low levels of trust are equally damaging to democratic functioning. It's not good to trust fully, or it's not good to trust, not to trust. So we are trying to reach a typology about the citizens, about what kind of levels of trust they have, and how does it end, basically, in behavior, in attitudes and in behavior. Basically, this is very difficult to understand through the surveys, the behavior, but in the forthcoming 2 years.
So Imre, your question, I think, was about the impact of shocks on trust.
Yes.
So that's what we can put to the speakers. I think
yes,
it's a really
please
good
do. Please,
example,
thank you very much.
right?
Thank you very much for the opportunity to present this stuff. I believe
Thank you. Thank you, Imre. I think any of these shocks, so it's coronavirus, or it can be an economic crisis, or it can be a change of leadership and a shock to the democracy, or it can be, January the 6th, or any of those shocks have an opportunity to look at dynamics. So I think that's really good. So that's been a really helpful contribution, Emma, for that idea. And the last question that we have here is also from Alessandros, and this is about the concepts that we're using, and it relates very much to what Emma also finished on, and it's about trust or mistrust or distrust. Are these things that we should focus on? And again, I think that David mentioned that we need to focus more on mistrust and distrust. And in my own book, which I'll tout while we're here as well, which is to hand, I argue, of course, that mistrust is great. There's not a problem of mistrust per se. It depends on performance. If you mistrust those who are corrupt or who are basically demagogues or promising things they can't deliver, that is a good position from the point of view of citizens. Just as it's good to trust those who do deliver. So the concepts that we're using, I think, Alessandros, was the question that you were focused on. Did you want to expand on that a little?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much. So the sort of motivation for this question is my sort of intuition for keeping things as simple as possible in terms of concepts. And then the question is if there's an added value to differentiating further between distrust and mistrust. So, I mean, I can see the argument in favor of it, but at the same time, in terms of measurement, I'm not sure if it's so sound and if it can really correspond to this difference that we make at a conceptual level.
That's right.
So
Is it
in terms
useful?
of providing scale, yeah, so is it useful? Is it not? I want to gauge the speaker's opinion. And also, if I may sort of add to the previous speaker and the sort of a discussion about shocks, it's also very interesting to sort of start thinking about the different dimensions that the shock has. So it's an economic crisis, but is it really the economy? Is it the incumbent's response? Is it could be politicization, very many things that could be the real driver of it. And how do we think of going to getting on this effect? So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alexandros. And of course, Richard Rose used that concept of distrust and mistrust in Russia and so on. And Jerry Stoker has taken that further in the project in the University of Southampton. So just very briefly, we have kind of 1 minute, I'm afraid. I do apologize to our speakers and presenters, but I'd just like to wrap up with any of the thoughts that you might have at the very end, just a brief one. Monica, can I start with you since you started the presentations as well? Any comments on any of the comments and questions we've had?
Very interesting comments. So just touch upon maybe two things. One, regarding the practicality of measuring distrust and trust. I think that the fact that all the presentation that we gave is there is a sort of a scale in terms of trust. So it's not a yes or no question, but actually there is a scale. So I think that with the richness of the results that you have, this is enough to distinguish between trust and distrust, and looking at the at the extremes, if you want, right, in terms of distrust. That's my opinion. Again, as we all said, repeated, the point is not so much to have this this measure. Importantly, as Carrie said, is you compare across institutions in order to say whether something is that level high or low. You compare over time to understand what has happened. So I think mistrust is a different concept. I very much agree on the fact that actually the point is to the jury, I think, is still out on the fact whether people feel that they have the means to check the performance of governments, right, in democracy. I'm talking about, to check the performance, so their accountability, to check they have the right set of information that is not only the information provided by the government, but is more the broader ecosystem of the media, of the independent information, of how strong is the fight against disinformation and misinformation, how successful that is. So I think that it's valuable to first to check that. That was one point that I said we want to add in the next round of the survey, is first of all, what's the expectation of citizens regarding if they can, first of all, if the government gives the information that is needed and if they can check upon them, and then see, obviously, correlate this with trust. And so we will measure, we will be able then to say whether this is an important aspect, measuring mistrust, which I think it is, this concept of obviously verify, as Pippa already said. The very last point regarding, yes, of course, checking the perception with the performance and with objective indicators. However, I will be a little bit cautious when we do this analysis at macro level, because unfortunately, most of these macro level governance performance indicators on corruption, on integrity, etc. These are yet again expert services. Right. So when we then, there is already, as we know, a lot of collinearity between the trust and if then we are also crossing a composite index of corruption based on expert views with composite index of trustworthiness of institution, exactly what are we measuring? So I'm just saying let's be, but we need to do it, but let's be cautious. Thanks.
It's a hall of mirrors, as you say, after a while. And that's why I like David's last chart, because that was actual stock performance against public opinion. And that for me is a concrete indicator, just like I'd say levels of economic development or levels of inflation, for example, in Europe, is a concrete measure. But anyway, we should certainly discuss that further. We are running out of time, really, I'm afraid. One more minute. Carrie first and then David. Please, Carrie, any final thoughts on the presentations and the comments?
Sure. I mean, thank you so much. And this has been fascinating. I'm glad to see everyone here doing this kind of work. I would just leave you with a thought about what is performance. I mean, you were struck by a high level performance, which is easy enough for a business because they have a single mission, make money. Okay. That's not true for government. And I think you might want to unpack that. I mean, Monica actually talked about disenfranchised groups. That's one way to think about performance. Government performance doesn't affect everyone equally. To the extent you're interested in understanding that variation, I think you're going to have to kind of unpack what you think of as performance.
And of course, it depends on what people want. If people want to have high spending and they trust the government to perform, that's one thing. If they don't, because they're conservative, then it's the opposite effect. So you need to know absolutely.
I mean, bread and butter, of course, is great, but I'm also thinking about when things go really wrong, when people are mistreated in a very bad way. That's performance too. So I would go beyond the kind of bread and butter thinking.
Yeah. I mean, trust in the police, for example, with Black Lives Matter and so on. So that's a really good point. And David, I think you have almost the last word before I come back to Cassina and Christian. David.
Yeah, so let me just 3 quick points in response to the question. So the one about autocracy, if we're going to discuss autocracies and trust, we have to include Russia. We've collected data in Russia up to the time of the Ukraine war, and they were at the lowest level of trust. So it's not like all autocracies have high levels of trust. Some do, some don't. We need to be able to explain that in any explanation we have around autocracies. In terms of opportunities, we often see trust bubbles forming around opportunities. Just after major events, we'll see trust go up. We've even seen trust go up in government. It tends to come crashing down the next year when we circled the wagons around an institution and they didn't perform. So they're very much a double-edged sword. They're an opportunity for institutions to rehabilitate their trust reputation. They're also an opportunity for them to prove once again that they have feet of clay. And then in terms of trust and trustworthiness, one of the things we've been looking at, trust and distrust, one of the things we've been looking at actually is a net trust score, where you take the trusters minus the distrusters and look at the gap there, or look what the resulting number is, because that gives you a good sense of not only how much trust there is in society, but how much distrust is, because those two forces tend to work in opposition. And you get a lot of new, interesting insight looking at both things simultaneously rather than one versus the other.
Thank you, David. That's absolutely right. 3 excellent points there. So last word, Cassina, any thoughts that you wanted to add? Cassina very kindly organized this whole event, and she's the person who very much keeps the project going through them. Any thoughts, Cassina? And then we'll just finalize with Christian.
Thank you very much, Pippa. Well, I think we are out of time for substantive thoughts. I would like to thank our excellent presenters for their very interesting, very informative presentations, and of course, Pippa for her magnificent moderating skills. Our project is still very young. We are at the beginning of a very long way, and we are very happy and grateful to you today for this excellent start of the discussion. And we're very much looking forward to welcoming you at our next events, whether webinars or conferences, to continue the conversations on trust. And please subscribe to our newsletter. We would like to establish a network of researchers who study trust. Thank you.
Thank you for organizing everything. And the last word goes to Christian Hofren, who is the principal investigator for the project. Any last thoughts, Christian?
Yes, thank you, Pippa. Pippa is together with me the principal investigator of the whole program. And in presence, we have the national directors in our meeting now of Germany, Chris Wetzel, of Sweden, Professor Kuranen, of Poland, of Greece, of Romania. And we are also the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee of the World Survey, Professor Miller from Michigan. So you'll see many people are working on them today and hopefully also in the future. As Pippa and Xenia said, we are at the beginning. We started in January. We had a kickoff meeting in Slovakia in March. And please watch the space. We have Facebook sites for all our partners in Slovak, in Czech, in Polish. And we have newsletters and we have a whole propaganda machine, and we are happy that you are consulting our propaganda machine, which is not fake news, it's mostly scientific news. And looking forward to see you at many webinars and other events, because as the founder of Management Science said, it's not enough to do good research. It's important to talk about it, and today was a very good way of talking about it. So I hand back to Pippa as the co-leader of the project, and we are very happy that we have the leading experts of trust research in the world in our team. Thank you.
So thank you so much, and thanks to everybody who participated. I hope this is the start of a collaboration, not the end of a collaboration, and we continue this network, and we continue to develop some of these ideas. We'll have other events. We'd love to engage you in those as well, and cross-national surveys, and checking how far there's actual replication. So our items actually carry across these different surveys is an invaluable thing to do. Thanks to everybody. Real pleasure to see you all, and look forward to seeing you at our next event. truedem.eu is our website. Just go there for any other information. Thanks very much to everybody.
Thank you.